Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're working on this single cylinder diesel generator. It is powered by a Yanmar clone, and some of you might remember this machine. This was given to the channel by a subscriber, Bill, who's owned it since new. This machine, new out of the box, never produced power. So we ended up repowering it with a Ryobi generator, and for the first time we got this thing rolling coal. Anyway, fast forward a year and a half, and this machine has made it back to me. It was sold to a local viewer, and I don't think he's used it a whole lot. But he did start it recently and said that the engine was surging. So, I have some ideas on what that could be. But before we try to fix that problem, let's just get it started as is, see what it's doing, and go from there. So yeah, not too hard to reproduce the problem. The engine, it's definitely starving for fuel. So likely we have some contamination in the diesel, maybe some air. I'm not sure, but that is the likely candidate. So I'm going to roll this inside. We'll take a sample of fuel and go from there. All right, let's take a sample of the fuel, see what kind of condition it's in. Yeah, I probably should have changed it when it was here. Diesel's a lot more forgiving, but it's likely been in there for 10 plus years, and that could be the issue. Yeah, I wouldn't say it looks great. It is a little hazy, but I don't see any water. There is some trash, though, in the fuel. I'm not sure if you can see that. So I'm not sure if that's rust, debris, potentially algae. Either way, this fuel has been in there a very long time, so I think we should drain it out and start fresh before digging any deeper. Yeah, I'm not liking what I'm seeing here in the tank. So there is rust on the bottom of the tank, and likely that indicates that there was water in the system. Thankfully, though, there is a fuel filter. You can kind of just see it there in the top. So any rust that breaks free should be held back and not contaminate the rest of the system. And I know it's pretty hard to see in here, but I'm going to pull the line off the diesel tank. So I'm just shutting the fuel valve off. And once we get the line off, we'll just run another line to an external tank. I just want to try to drain as much as I can out of the tank and maybe also flush it with some fresh diesel and just make sure that that filter is not restricted. And we're not getting any flow, but the level, I brought it down pretty low. So let's add some fresh new diesel and make sure it can make it out of the tank. All right, well, I think we found our problem. The fuel, it is barely coming through that filter. So I think we need to dig in a little deeper here. Now, I don't have much experience with this type of diesel setup, so hopefully these filters are available. And the tank, I think we'll clean it up a bit while we have it off. So let's drain the tank down again. We'll get the tank removed, clean it up, get a new filter, and hopefully that'll solve this run issue. And we also need to get off these other two lines. And I believe they're just fuel return lines. Probably not as critical to keep air out of them, but I'm going to cap them off like I did the main line just to minimize, the need to bleed the system once we get things sorted out. All right, let's see if we can get this removed. No, that one's stripping out. There we go. So that's what the filter looks like. I did check eBay real quick. It is available. We can get a new filter. I'm guessing just all the particles of rust kind of clogged it up. And I'd say it's been in there for a long time because it's tearing very easily. So at a minimum, we need to replace this, but I'm kind of worried about the tank. Any new filter we put in there, is likely going to clog up in pretty short order. So now that we have this valve off, let's just finish draining the tank, and then we'll come up with a plan on how to fix this issue. And just two 10mm nuts hold that filter to the valve. And a little corrosion because this thing is not budging. There we go. Okay, and that's pretty much it. So the good news is the actual valve is in very good condition. This seal also looks pretty good. Backside has a few seals which I would say need to be replaced. And of course, the filter for sure needs to be replaced. But we still have the issue with the tank. And there's a look at some of the rust that came out of the tank once we pulled the filter out of the way. So, we could just get a new filter, throw it in, and it would work for a while. But ultimately, the rust in the tank is going to clog it up again. And these filters and the gaskets, they're not cheap. It's probably around $20 to do a filter change. So it wouldn't take too many filter changes before, the cost really adds up. And when you consider a new tank is only $75, probably makes sense to go that route rather than trying to just swap out filters or even, clean this up with evaporust. Evaporust is about $20 to $30 a gallon. And again, you're going to quickly exceed the cost of a new tank, either in the cost of the evaporust or just the cost of your time. So I am going to place an order for a new tank, a new filter, and when it arrives, we'll get it installed, and hopefully that fixes the run issue. Although I'm pretty confident that if we just put a new tank in there, that the run issue will be resolved, I'd like to know that for sure. So I am going to rig up a temporary fuel system. I think the only complication is that we have so many fuel lines here that we need to deal with. And all the tanks I have aren't set up for a return feed, but I'm sure we can jerry-rig something at least for a quick test. So I'm thinking we could probably use a little tank like this for a snowblower and just clamp it in place. Now, the fuel output, it is a 1/4-inch barb, and I believe this is 5/16 or maybe 3/8 as far as the main line goes. So we're going to have to adapt that down. And as far as the fuel returns, I think if we just take the cap off, stick the fuel returns into the tank, then this should be enough, at least for a quick test. So I think I have a winning combination here of adapters. So this is a quick connect for a boat tank. It is 3/8, which I believe will fit in this line. And then I have an adapter which plugs into the quick connect that adapts it down to 1/4 inch. So that'll run up to the tank. And then these return lines right here, again, we'll just bring it in through the cap on the tank, and I think we'll be in good shape. And before I connect this, I want to see if I can bleed any air out in this part of the line. So if I depress this, I think that'll open up the valve. Yep. And we're getting fuel to flow. And hopefully the air to purge. So connect that up. And that just leaves the returns. So the only real return we need to worry about is the one that comes off the injector. This one, I believe it's just to purge air. And just to show you a little better on this one, the main fuel supply comes down this big line right here, and it goes into the pump. But right here, teed off, is this other line. And I believe all it does is allow air to purge right up to the pump and then kind of flow back to tank level. In this case, obviously we don't have the correct tank, but we can remove this and just let the system purge the air if there is any in there. And no, it is all fuel coming out. So I'm going to leave that plug in place. We don't need to run that to the tank, but this one that comes from the injector, we do need to extend that into the tank. And we'll just take this plug off. And hopefully it's 1/4 inch because that's the barb I'm using. Yep, and we'll run that right up to the tank. Yeah, I'm just going to put another barb on this end. Not because we're connecting it to anything, but it's kind of acting as a weight to help hold this in the tank. So theoretically, we should be ready to test. I guess my only concern is, is this going to shake so much that fuel splashes out of the top or the whole tank falls off? I'm not sure, but I think we're not going to know until we try. We've got this back outside. I'm going to try to start it again with the alternative fuel tank. And I'm sure there's some air in the system, so we might have to work through that. But I'm hoping once it does work through it, that the engine speed will be stable. Well, for a second there, I thought the issue was going to persist. I almost shut it down in defeat. I let it run just a bit longer, and thankfully I did, because the engine started to run well. Any air in the system must have purged out now that we have a good tank with a good filter, and we had no issues at all running. Just to make sure, I put a 3,000 watt load on, and everything continued to run well. So I think all we need is a new tank, and this machine should be good to go. So now that we have some heat in the engine, let's just change the oil. And it looks like the whole thing is going to spin out. So let's hold that still. And there's a look at the oil that came out. Pretty dark, but typical for diesel oil. The good news is there is no metal in the oil, so the engine most likely is in good health. And it's a few days later. We've got ourselves a brand new tank. So this one, it is pretty much spotless inside, but it does not come with the cap or the fuel valve. So I did remove the cap from the old tank, which theoretically should fit on the new, which it does. And then we just need to clean this up and move the old valve over, get the new filter installed, and we should be good to go. And the new gasket kit came with these 3 gaskets right here, which appear to be the 3 for the bottom side of the plate, but it did not come with the gasket on the other side where the valve attaches, so we're going to have to be careful not to cause any damage to that. But these gaskets, we need to remove them, clean up the plate, and then we can get the new gaskets installed. Interesting. So it looks like we were using this gasket and that gasket. This third one might not be needed for this machine because it does not look like we have it here. I'm noticing the new tank does have a gasket installed, but it is damaged. So I do think that maybe this was supposed to come with a valve and someone might have taken it off. I'm not quite sure. But either way, we got to get the gasket off the tank as well so that we can get a new one in its place. So we can definitely use this gasket. This is what was used on the old tank. But the other gasket that came with this, I think could actually do the same thing. We could just install it. On this side, we use the rubber seal, the new filter, and we can then bolt this in place. And we're going to get basically the same seal that we would have with this style gasket. So I don't think it's going to matter too much which one we use. All right, so we're going to get this fitting removed. And I may have stretched it out a little bit. So I'm not sure if it's going to fit on the valve unless we cut it back a little. So there is one pretty big difference on this tank, and that's the fact that we only have one spot for a return line, whereas this setup has two. So the critical line here is the one from the injector that we could plumb right in, and technically we could just leave this capped off. You know, really the only time you would need to open it is if you were going to bleed out the system. But in my case, I think I'm going to use a T. You know, we'll connect both of these up and then run a single feed into the tank return. And that is not a 1/4 inch. Interesting. So I believe it was a 1/4 inch fitting on the other tank. Yeah, and of course I just cut off the part of the hose that was stretched out to a 1/4 inch over here on the injector line. So I did not realize that. So I ended up adapting this line right here. You know, I cut off some of the extra because we didn't need the full length. But what I didn't realize is that this line is a 3/16 line. And right at the end, it expanded to 1/4 inch. You can kind of see that right there. That's the piece I cut off. Pretty small on that side, much larger on that side. So this is kind of a specialty part. And with that cut off, I had to use an adapter. And this barbed fitting converts a 3/16 back to a 1/4 inch, which is what we need to connect to the tank. So now that it's 1/4 inch again, we'll add a piece of fuel line, 1/4 inch, along with the clamp. And then we're going to use the T and another clamp on this end. So we're going to give this a quick try now that we have the new tank installed. I want to see that the engine starts, that it runs nice and smooth, and probably more important, that the fuel delivery can keep up with the demand under a full load. So this machine, it is rated at 6,000 watts. So I'm going to get the engine started, assuming it starts and runs well. We'll put a half load on it, double check the outputs, and then we'll go for the max of 6,000 watts. Well, considering, it's a cold day, this engine has no glow plugs. It started up without a whole lot of effort. So without a load, we're starting pretty good at about 61 Hertz, 121 volts. And the THD, we're probably not going to pay too much attention to. The last time we tested this, it topped out at about 23.5. So it should be the same this time. So I'm going to apply a half load of 3,000 watts. So there's 2,000, 3,000. Engine speed, rock solid, steady. Okay, no issues at all at a half load. So let's bring the load up to 4,000 watts, no issues, 5,000, 5,500. Engine speed hasn't budged at all. We're still at about 60 Hertz at 5,500 watts. Let's try 6,000. Yeah, no problem whatsoever. And the THD, like last time, 23.9, 24. So not great, but fairly typical for a machine like this. So let's give it a few minutes, then we'll shut it down. No issues at all at 6,000 watts, so let's push it a little bit further. I'm going to swap these lighter loads for a heavier 6,000. Let's try 6,500. Yeah, it's doing it. Let's try 7,000. And we're out of power. We're losing speed, and it's definitely over-fueling a bit, so let's take the load off. And we'll let things cool down. So yeah, it did pretty well. You know, it started easy, ran well. We got it up to the rated load of 6,000 watts and even a bit beyond. So, you know, as it is right now, I think it'll be good for quite some time. But, you know, I've got to wonder, when we worked on this a year and a half ago, what condition was the tank in? You know, I took a quick look in there, but couldn't really see the bottom. And I kind of dismissed it, you know, being that this was diesel. Diesel fuel tends to not go bad. But I'd say, you know, that rust in there says otherwise. You know, likely there was some water contamination at some point, and ultimately that filter clogged up and the machine stopped working. So, you know, it was an easy fix, and with a bit of care, this should last a good long time. So, I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.